In this video, I'll introduce the user interface of Photoshop.
Depending on which version you're using, you'll see a slightly different opening menu when you open the program itself. For version 2020 that I'm using here, I have this welcome screen. Gives me a few ways to get into the program. I can scroll down and open recently used files. I can create a new file, or I can open a file somewhere else on my desktop here or PC. I'm going to, in this case, I'm going to click and drag an image that I have on my desktop directly into Photoshop. And I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. Photoshop is an enormous program, and we're going to touch on a lot of different elements over the coming weeks. What I'm going to do here, though, is talk about some of the key tools that we're going to use over and over again. These are going to be some of the most frequently used tools in Photoshop. And by and large, they're all located in this ribbon to the left of the screen. There's also hotkey options to get to the same tools, and we'll talk about that a little bit as we go as well. Let's start with the very top, which is the Move tool. You get a little animation when you hover over with your icon. It'll give you a little bit of an idea of what each tool does, right? The hotkey for the Move tool is V. Second down is the elliptical marquee tool. If I right click on this, it will toggle to a rectangular marquee tool. Get an idea of what that does. I can select a bit of my image here. If I right click on the image, it starts to give me options about what I can do with what I've just selected. I can transform it, which we'll see later will give me the option to bend and twist and flip what I select. We can cut it from the image, or we can copy it from the image. I'm going to select copy this time. And just to give you an idea, in my layer menu over here, we'll talk about layers definitely in a little bit. What I've just copied, you can see with the Move tool, I can move what I've just copied, right? I can go up and down, and and with this copied bit from this image, I can, if I hold Shift, I can start to thin it out. I can make it taller. Just start to get an idea of so many options that we have. Let's continue though. Let's not get too into the weeds just yet. Third down is the Lasso tool. This is another one we're going to end up using a lot, and our animation here gives us a little bit of an idea of what the Lasso tool does. I'm going to go back into the image, and I'm going to Command D to unselect this prior, this copied bit that I used. If I click on the Lasso tool, you'll see it does something similar to what the rectangular marquee did. I've got these marching ant bits here. Gives you an idea of what is actually selected at the moment. I'm going to Command D and unselect that. Let's go into our first layer and look at something in the same way. I clicked off the visibility of the previously copied layer by clicking off the eyeball here. I'm back onto the layer for the background, and I have used the Lasso tool to select a bit of this background. I'm going to, in the same way that I use the rectangular marquee, I'm going to right click and copy, and I've got yet another layer showing up now with the new selection. If I click back up to the Move tool, I can move around that lassoed image that I just made. And you can see the cursor gets this bit of a curved arrow. That means actually at this point I can rotate this if I choose. And if I hit Shift and take one of these corners or this middle portion here, I can elongate it. I could go this way. I could grab the whole thing and start to shape it like that. Let's continue with some of these other tools. Up next is, this is the cropping tool. This is another one that'll be very helpful if you find yourself wanting to extend your image a bit, right? If you choose this middle portion on the right, for example, left click and hold and pull, we've made the entire image a bit longer horizontally, right? I'll hit enter and I'll make it a permanent selection. Likewise, I can grab the top middle and go down and hit enter again, and I've changed the size of the file that way, right? Let's continue on our ribbon here. The eyedropper tool. This is going to give me this. See my cursor now? It looks like an eyedropper. If I left click onto my image, you see this box here? This is the foreground color. This is the color that is functional right now. If I click another part of the image, you see it's turned gray. Now it's very white-ish. Here's gray. I can just go on and on, right? What does that do? Sort of ties in a little bit with what we're going to talk about next, and that is our brush. Hotkey for this one is B. You'll find yourself probably hitting this one from time to time. If I click on B for brush, I've got, now my selector looks like this. If I right click, I'll start to get the options to do a lot of things with this digital brush. We'll talk much more about this as we go, but for now, let's make our brush a little bit smaller. You can see it has made our cursor a smaller brush now. And if I left click and drag, I'm starting to paint with the foreground color. If we want to change the color, let's make it this darker color. I hit B, I'm on brush again. Now I've got a darker color. Let's do a few more. Here's an eraser. You may find yourself using this from time to time as well. And it does pretty much what you'd expect an eraser to do. Now you can see at the moment I have to go over these bits quite a few times with my eraser, and that's because the eraser is functioning at only 45% opacity. So when I go over this painted line that I'm trying to erase, I'm erasing 45% of it at a time. If I want to erase much more quickly, you can see how the eraser is functioning differently now. Click onto another layer, same thing. Now, you see this fuzzy edge on the eraser that it's doing? That's because the eraser at the moment is behaving in a brush-like manner, an airbrush-like manner, and that is because it is currently selected as this brush. We'll talk much more about brushes as we go, but just for demonstration purposes, let me show you what happens when I change the kind of brush I'm using for the eraser. Let's turn it into this hard round, and let's make it a little bit smaller. And you see how much more definitive now the brush is behaving. Likewise, if we go into another layer, you see how sharp it is now. Okay, very good. Let's do a few more before we expand into other parts of Photoshop. Let's talk about a gradient. Gradients can be used in a lot of different ways in Photoshop. For this demonstration, let me create a new layer, which is down here in the lower right corner. My new layer here is layer 3. Let's go back up to our regular marquee and select the entire file and come back to gradient. You'll start to see we've got some options for our gradient. We've got a traditional sort of very dark to very light. Let's see what happens when we use that. From the left side of our selection, I'm going to left click and hold, and I'm going to drag this selector all the way from the left to the right. And I'm going to release, and you immediately have what was promised. You have a very dark to very light. And now you're probably thinking, well, now I've lost my whole image, right? With gradients, the power of what a gradient can do is in this layer style. And let me show you a bit of what that can do by, I'm going to deselect by Command D on the gradient layer. I'm going to open this menu with this drop down where it says normal. See, now we have dissolve, darken, multiply, and you can see immediately it's giving me a preview of what each of these layer styles will do if I select it. Overlay, soft light, hard light, vivid light. And the best way to get familiar with what these can do is to get to a point where you're playing around with them. And I encourage you to do the same. It's the only way that I really got comfortable with them. It's just knowing what to expect when you lay a gradient down and you go to darker color. You'll start to anticipate you're going to get something that looks like this, or a color dodge. You're going to get a really explosive light. Color dodge add. It's even more dramatic than you see the difference between a color dodge add. Now, if you are happy with this, but you just wish it wasn't so intense, you can select opacity here and drop it back a bit. Now you still have the gradient effect of the color dodge, but it's not as intense. Likewise, fill does a lot along the same lines. You can see in real time how it's changing. Let's bring it back up, and let's choose multiply for our gradient. I'll continue talking about the tool ribbon in part 2.